The story began on a fine day when the protagonist, Toby, was on his way to a company retreat along with his colleagues. Toby was popularly known as a 9-to-5 power horse, slaving for the company's corporate baddie, Sarah. His colleagues were even jealous of him because she was one of the most beautiful and most coveted women in their company. But only Toby knew she was a hopelessly evil slave driver and the adversary of rest. He decided to take a nap when he had reached his limit, but then the company's bus got involved in an accident. When Toby woke up, he was in a completely different realm, facing a lady claiming to be a guide for the souls of the reincarnated. She welcomed him to the labyrinth country, where he was reborn as a seeker, handed him the seeker's license, instructed him to use it to get a job at the guild, and then wished him a good life. Toby was trying to figure himself out, but right as he arrived at the guild, he heard his boss's voice and was surprised to find that Sarah and a few other colleagues had also reincarnated into the labyrinth kingdom. She immediately began hounding him about work and telling him to choose a job she could rely on. Toby was reminded of his toxic past life and realized that his reincarnation was a miracle, so he wasn't about to waste the chance by reliving the same life he had. In his new life, Sarah was a Valkyrie who could wield swords and spears while using spirit magic, and even though she was hoping Toby would want to team up with her, he disappointed her by saying he would work with other people. She was disappointed but hid it nicely, accepting that she had to find a new party. However, she threatened that the next time they met, she would make sure he regretted his decision. Somewhere along the line, Toby was approached by a walking milk fountain named Louisa, who said she would be his assistant and counselor. She informed him that the labyrinth country was composed of numerous labyrinths, and seekers were tasked with bringing back valuables from the labyrinths. Afterwards, she walked him through the process of job selection, advising him to choose wisely because that would ultimately affect his social status. The lowest-ranked seekers could only afford to live at the stables, so by all means, Toby had to aim for the top. Eventually, he chose the job of a rear guard, which would entail supporting his team members using recovery and support magic. However, a system malfunction occurred, and he was assigned an undefined job. Louisa informed him that in the worst-case scenario, Toby might end up partying with no one. Afterward, she gave him some copper tickets to hire a mercenary until he understood his job. Seeing how bad things could be for him, he already regretted not joining Sarah, but the moment he remembered that he had kissed the corporate slave life goodbye, he decided he would just hire a mercenary and learn about his skills. Luckily, one super-ripped muscle mommy who was a mercenary appeared and introduced herself as Layla, the guild's second-in-command. After he explained his situation, Layla led him to a demi-human who was a cute, petite-framed lizardman named Teresa. Layla explained that Teresa was a former human being who was attacked by monsters in the labyrinth, leading to a mutation that rendered her a demi-human. They used her as a mercenary because she could only move by someone else's command since she had no human will of her own, and for that reason, she was best used as a mercenary. Toby didn't get a word she said, but still left with Teresa. They arrived at the beginner's labyrinth known as the Plains of Dawn, and a huge guy who helped out novice seekers approached him, offering his assistance should anything come up during his labyrinth raid. In the process, he overheard the guys gossiping about his manager and her beauty, which attracted a great variety of seekers in her party. Toby was glad that he won't have to worry about her well-being, but the guys could tell from his disposition that she was his ex. So the huge guy advised Toby that no matter what happened in their past lives, he and Sarah should watch out for each other because they could both die easily. They parted ways and Toby walked for a while until a furball monster sprang out of nowhere and attacked him. Luckily, Teresa jumped in swiftly and defended him against the crazy monster. At that moment, Toby's eyes were wide open in shock as he realized the reality of death before him, while the faces of his loved ones flashed in his mind. The furball wasn't relenting in its attacks, so Toby decided to quit and told Teresa to escape immediately. However, the girl refused to give up and kept fighting the furball. This reminded Toby that Layla had asked him to keep in mind that even though Teresa was a demi-human, she could also feel human emotions such as pain and anger. So as he watched her battle the furball and get defeated repeatedly, he begged her to stop so they would retreat. Before he knew it, she was back on her feet again, trying to defend him. and that awakened the desire in him to stop being such a big-for-nothing and protect her as the rear guard that he ought to be. He activated his support defense magic and shielded Teresa from the furball's attack, granting her the chance to slice and finish it off. Finally, they got a good look at it and found that it was just a golf ball with a silly goat face. He immediately turned his attention to Teresa and apologized to her, saying he was grateful that she protected him but swore that from that day onward, he would certainly protect her. Their peaceful conversation was interrupted by some noise, which led him towards the cliff to find his boss and her party members struggling for their lives. Seeing that Sarah was in trouble, Toby's first instinct was to jump in and help, but he remembered that Teresa was present and that he was responsible for her. So he asked her to call supporters and reinforcements and also get medical treatment for herself while he stayed back to help Sarah and her team. However, Teresa stubbornly defied his orders and took the lead to rescue the people. They arrived to find Sarah and her team members facing a high-ranking furball named Redface. While her moronic, toad-brained team members argued back and forth, even in their life-threatening situation, Sarah struggled all by herself to handle the monster. When the monster almost had her teammates, she dove in to save her people and then announced that they would retreat immediately. One of the members tapped their tablet to activate the scroll of return, and Sarah's teammates had disappeared from the scene, leaving her behind. The furball came for her, so Toby distracted it by firing with his catapult. Sarah turned and noticed his presence but warned him not to draw any closer because the monster was too powerful and was at a level so high that novices like them couldn't defeat it. However, Toby refused to stop and kept firing at the furball to give Sarah a chance to escape. Simultaneously, Teresa stepped in to help and tried tackling the furball by herself. While Teresa bought them some time, Toby jumped in to rescue Teresa, and her mind drifted back to the time on Earth when she yeeted most of her admirers because Toby was giving it to her real good. So when, in their reincarnated life, he chose to team up with strangers instead of her, she had to swear to make him regret his decisions by working hard and proving herself worthy. Instead of remaining as the damsel in distress, Sarah quickly sprang back up to her feet, saying she would no longer run away because she had always been running away from her personal problems. With unwavering determination, Sarah gathered all the strength left in her and dashed forth with her spear, attacking the fur ball with a thunderbolt spell. At the same time, Toby attempted to support her by activating his defense barrier, but in the middle of her attack against the fur ball, the barrier refused to activate. As such, the fur ball rammed itself straight through her spear, dividing it into two and sending her flying in the air. Seeing her bleed out and probably fall to her death, Toby was horrified and created a barrier to protect her. It failed again, but when he tried with Teresa, it worked on her. This made Toby try to figure out why, and then he remembered that the support defense reduced the damage taken by frontline members of his own party by 10 points. Hence, it didn't work for Teresa because she wasn't a member of his party. He suddenly started blaming himself for what happened to her, regretting not teaming up with her when the opportunity presented itself. So he asked her to join his party so he could use his skill on her. However, Sarah began apologizing that she had run her mouth too much, and even after being reborn, she still didn't live up to expectations. While this was going on, Teresa was busy trying to subdue the furball. Toby apologized to Sarah, saying it was his fault for running away without trying to understand her feelings. But now he was also reborn. He would never abandon her again. Thereafter, he told Teresa that he had figured out a way to defend against the monster's attacks. During the fight, he had noticed that she remained unscathed, meaning the attack power of the monster was less than 10 points. If that was really the case, then Toby could reinforce Teresa's attack by 10 points, and that would pose a significant threat to the beast. He apologized for making her do what he considered extreme, but said he only needed her to help just one last time. Afterwards, Teresa swung into action, but right before she could strike the monster, it seemed the creature could predict her movement and launched itself upwards. Immediately after, it started heading towards Toby. And that was bad news because Toby was not a target for support defense, so he just had to avoid it manually. However, the thing still avoided Toby, and that was when he realized that its primary aim was Sarah. So before it could get to her, both Toby and Teresa ran after the beast. Teresa had used a speed booster named Acceleration Dash, while Toby instead turned to support her and amplified the strength of her sword gain. Thereafter, she sliced the furball in two, but it initially caused an explosion and tried to escape. However, she sliced it multiple times, and it eventually yielded to defeat. In the end, both Toby and Teresa were exhausted, but with Sarah almost dying, he still asked Teresa to run and seek help. While he was tending to Sarah, it seems Teresa, despite being speechless, was quite worried and jealous to see him care so deeply for Sarah. When she left, Toby checked his status and found that he had leveled up to level 2 and also acquired 2 skill points. With that, he could also acquire recovery to help Sarah get back on her feet. Up until this very day, he never knew just how far she could go for him and had never seen that side of her until that day. He acquired the recovery and reassured her that help was on the way, but he would keep her going using his skill as first aid. He noticed that her airbags were calling out to him, so he took off his coat and covered her with it while positioning himself behind her. She was feeble, so he asked her to try and accept his invitation to join his party so he could use his skill to help her. With that, she successfully joined the party, and the scene changed to show the demon sword girl running towards the scene of the fight against the fur ball. On the way, she dealt with smaller fur balls so easily along with her party member, the new girl named Suzuna. Susie backed her up with archery, while the demon sword girl named Elisha reassured her that if they kept working together, she would level up pretty quickly. On the other hand, Toby was still in the process of using the recovery skill on Sarah. So as he bestowed it on her, some of her wounds quickly disappeared. He was soon joined by Susie and Elisha, who came to ask him where the terrible monsters were, but they were shocked to find that the red Watadama named Redface, who could typically annihilate a level 3 party all by itself, was successfully defeated by Toby and Sarah, who were just novices. She asked them if they had assistance from a high-level party, and Toby shared that there was a demi-human girl who took off to call for an immediate rescue. Still, Elisha couldn't believe what they had accomplished with very little assistance, so she asked if they were talented tamers or anything of that nature. However, Toby shared that he had yet to understand anything about his job. While he was talking, Elisha fell in love at first sight, wishing those stupid girls around him would just die. Susie introduced herself, and Ellie did the same, at the same time warning Toby not to let anyone know, aside from those he trusted, that he had subjugated the red-face Watadama. This was because every promising newbie was sure to attract many people who would want them in their party, but there were surely going to be a bunch of bad people in the mix. For example, the White Knight Brigade, whom she particularly warned him to steer clear of. She asked for his license and placed the redhead into it, and then told him to take it to a monster dismantling shop in town because it could provide raw materials for his weapons and armor. From above, they heard voices belonging to the guys Teresa had called to help. As they took Sarah out on a stretcher, Toby returned to thank Ellie for all she had done for him and said he owed her one. Thereafter, they said their goodbyes and he reunited with Teresa, and then they planned to return home. At the same time, some old fools who had been spying on Ellie and Susie were glad to finally grab the opportunity to attack her. As the girls journeyed forth, however, they were unaware that some old fools had prepared an ambush for them. When they returned to the guild, Toby apologized for putting Teresa in harm's way, but she told him such a thing was inevitable, especially because the labyrinth was dangerous. Layla told Teresa to return inside and turn in her weapons for maintenance, since her exploration for the day was over. But Teresa held back for a minute and placed her hands on Toby, almost as if she was trying to share something with him. It was her own little way of saying goodbye, and Layla shared that it was the first time Teresa had demonstrated her willpower outside of battle, so she was shocked and wondered what Toby did to Teresa. Much later, Toby wandered into town on his own, unsure if there was a way for him to obtain a mercenary permanently. Lydia told him that only 100 copper tickets were needed for him to buy a mercenary, and she was only telling him that because she trusted him. Even though he only did one exploration with Teresa, Toby realized he could not advance without her, because her cooperation level was on another level. Meanwhile, he bumped into Louisa, who was glad to see him okay, and she informed him that Sarah was recovering at the hospital. Her wounds were apparently not that severe, so she would soon be discharged from the hospital. Louisa seemed to be worried, especially because she heard Toby had been attacked by a high-level monster. Speaking of the high-level monster, he called her to a private meeting and shared that he had subjugated the red-faced monster with Teresa. Louisa was shocked because Redface was a named monster, and such were high-level monsters that shouldn't be found on beginner floors, let alone be defeated by beginners. She informed him that the reward was 20 gold coins for subjugating the red-faced demon, but she soon started acting funny because she couldn't believe how fast he had progressed in such a short time. At his current rank, he would even be able to stay at a suite in the 8th district, and the credibility points he gained from his party had significantly high numbers of about 50. That indicated the trust rating towards a person, and such a thing couldn't usually be represented, but the license could calculate it as credibility, and the rate of credibility would affect contribution points. Usually that should be 5 points at a time for one-time explorations, but Toby managed to get all of that with 50 points in one day, which was high, even though he worked with a demi-human. In the end, Louisa boiled everything down to Toby's unknown job, and she thought it was the strongest class of rear guard jobs. He tried to assure her there was nothing like that, but she was pretty convinced and said she would convey the matter to the official bulletin without delay. But first of all, she asked him if he wished to conceal the fact that he had suffocated the Redface, and he said he wished to do so, because he was preventing himself from getting hounded by people who would want him in their guild. At the same time, Louisa informed him that Sarah's results were equally available. Sarah was looking at her own report while in a hospital bed, seeing how useless and incompetent she was because she had 0 contribution points. It hurt more because she knew she was too broke to afford anything better than a stable, so it felt like the worst day of her life. Toby walked in just then, and an awkward moment ensued between both of them. Sarah remembered that even though she couldn't recall what happened, something embarrassing may have occurred between them. Anyway, Toby told her he was glad she was okay, and she told him that she knew he was the one who defeated the redhead. In no time, he would be popular among parties of high-level seekers. She congratulated him on getting a big promotion in one day and thanked him for rescuing her. On the other hand, she acknowledged that her incompetence would be made known to the public, and it would be hard for her to join another party. However, Toby reassured her that nothing about their battle would be made public, and in fact, he was thinking of journeying at his own pace to avoid the hectic nature of his becoming famous. He also surprised her by giving her a documented invitation for her to remain as a member of his party, while acknowledging that he had once stupidly declined her invitation. However, Sarah said she felt terrible that she had been bossing him around for her personal advantage while they were on Earth, and then she still pretended to be strong by entering the labyrinth alone. Instead of saving anyone, she ended up being the one being saved and being unable to do anything, so she wondered why he would go so far for her. But Toby himself also did not understand why she went that far for him, because back when they were in the labyrinth, Sarah stood and fought right in front of him, not budging away from the dreadful monster and risking life and limb. As such, he stared her in the eyes and told her that there was no way he would allow a good-looking and reliable Valkyrie like herself to be a part of someone else's party, because that would truly be regrettable. With that, Sarah asked for a pen and signed the paper but warned him against touching her in weird places while he was using healing magic on her. Later, they headed into town, and Sarah shared with Toby something that had happened while she was on Earth. A reasonable man, her father's client from the company, was chosen to be her marriage partner. But this wasn't the first time her parents would ever be making decisions for her. And in fact, the only thing she was allowed to choose for herself was the job she ended up with. She tried her best to reach the top of her career, mostly because she didn't want to be under her parents' influence or control anymore. And it was for that reason that she worked Toby to the bone so she could accomplish what she wanted. Later, they arrived at Toby's suite, and Sarah suddenly felt like a burden because he had only gotten her clothes, and now again she would be staying in his suite with him. However, he told her she was an important party member as his manager. With a flushed expression, Sarah told him to stop calling her his manager because it was awkward, but she soon lost her mind and went berserk over the idea of staying alone with a man. Later, Sarah went in to have a bath at a public bathroom, and everyone retired for the night. She noticed that he had fallen asleep, but felt so terrible because Toby was fast asleep instead of trying to slide under her skirt. He had turned on the aid recovery feature on his tab, and though there was a partition between both of them, Sarah's body soon felt hot and intense because she was conscious of the fact that Toby was behind her. She made some happy noises, and Toby worried that something was wrong with her, but she couldn't just tell him that the only thing that could calm her down was his sausage. In the end, she got up and told him she would certainly be better off sleeping in the living room, and she couldn't understand her own body because a lot of things were making her uneasy. He realized that this was the effect of his skill, the aid recovery, because even the receptionist had pointed out so many weird things that happened that day, particularly the increase in his credibility score, and also he himself had noticed something acting up with Teresa. So it could be that the side effect of his aid recovery skill was leaving the poor girls in heat, craving him unstoppably. Instead of letting Sarah face the consequences for his own actions, he decided to go to sleep in the living room so she could have her privacy and ease the tension that plagued her. The next day, things were awkward as expected, but they decided they still had to go and hire Teresa, since she was their best bet at getting their teamwork in check. On the other hand, a happy lass passed by, hoping to join a three-person party. Coincidentally, she spotted Ellie and Susie and instantly knew where she wanted to be. But what she wasn't aware of was the plot those three old fools had to ambush the girls when they were in private. Later, Sarah thanked Teresa for her role in helping out, but the demi-human made her aware that she won't get even a smile from her. Toby had earlier asked about having Teresa join as a party member, but was told he needed 100 copper tickets, which was the equivalent of 30 gold coins. For him to earn that, they had to brace themselves for serious business. Later, they encountered a girl skillfully using a giant cleaver to dismantle the body of a dead monster. The shopkeeper introduced the girl as his daughter Melissa, while he himself was named Carton. Obviously, Melissa was young but had a top-notch talent for dismantling meat compared to the older folks, which was why she was carrying out such a huge task for her size. He assumed Toby and Sarah were a married couple, but they said they weren't, and then presented the corpse of the monster named Redface, asking what sorts of equipment could be made from it. The man told them he could use the monster's corpse to form a set of blaze equipment, and that could be made into 3 pieces of equipment. Toby selected a catapult named Blaze Shot, a red scarf, and a red buckler, all of which worked by fire-based damage reduction. Carton reminded them that every mercenary's equipment would be returned to the guild, including the crafted equipment. This meant they had to be twice as sure of using a named monster's rare materials for that. Toby affirmed that they were ready and said he had officially decided to make Teresa their companion. To make that happen, all they had to do was defeat a lot of Watadamas. However, they later found that it was impossible to achieve that goal on that day because the majority of the beasts had been exterminated, since some overly enthusiastic people grinding their levels stopped by and had subjugated most of them. In fact, Carton had a pile of those Watadama in a cart left behind by the said people. However, he said, if they insisted on going ahead with venturing that day, then they may proceed to the second level. He further explained that the labyrinth was separated by levels, and each time the former was cleared, they would be ushered into a deeper level. Experiences were required in number to increase the resources obtained and gain better quality, but so did the strength of the monsters and the danger of the traps as well. Usually, seekers who wished to advance to that level were around level 3 or 4, so Carton wouldn't personally recommend it, particularly because a brutal, high-ranking named monster had appeared. This reminded them of their gruesome encounter with Redface, but it didn't stop them from venturing further as they initially planned. They encountered a gate created by 2 colossal trees, which led to the second level. However, Toby advised that they end their venturing right there and then, since they had already confirmed the location of the entrance. He also said that they could continue accumulating experience and materials in the first level and save on their expenses. Suddenly, Susie sprang up from nowhere, saying she was surprised to meet them. They asked where Ellie was since they were both supposed to be together, but Susie, who was speechless, instantly urged them to run away because something was coming. She hadn't even finished speaking when an orc sprang out of a portal right behind her. Susie fired at it with an arrow, but her arrow, which stuck in the monster's skin, looked just like a splinter in the flesh. The The monster was about to put an end to Susie for good when Ellie sprang up from behind and landed multiple cuts on its body, instantly defeating it as it fell to the ground. She then admonished Susie not to stray away from her, despite her feelings. This was because Susie wanted more than the miserable amounts of experience she could get from the water damas and pushed herself to get more from the orcs in the second level. In summary, it was all thanks to Susie and Ellie's overzealousness that the Watadamas on the first floor were completely cleared. They mentioned something about her knowing that going to the second level was a mistake, and Ellie soon remembered that there was a girl still on the second level. So they turned to find the girl they were looking for, Misaki, who was the newest member of their party. Earlier that day, Ellie had welcomed Misaki into the party because she was Susie's best friend, but left to her alone, she would never accept such a quirky girl. However, Misaki was helpful because she was alert and attentive to her surroundings. She had found an interesting stone, which was later discovered to be the wind agate, which was a rare crystal. Misaki went on saying she was their lady luck, and that was all thanks to one of her multiple personalities, specifically the gambler. They encountered a box in the process, and Misaki was toying around with it, but it was already too late when Ellie realized it and could warn her not to press it. Instantly, the girl vanished in front of them, and they realized it was a treasure box that was armed with a trap. This was a deadly one because if one didn't have the skill and expertise to disarm the box and its trap, then in the worst-case scenario, death might occur. However, in the case of Misaki, it was a relocation trap, and she was transferred somewhere on the second level, so they couldn't see particularly where she would be found. She further explained that the treasure box was a rare item obtained from defeated monsters, and if it was difficult to open, they would take it back home and have it unlocked by box makers. Only one thing was certain. For such a rare box to appear so casually, someone must have left it there for them to unlock. Toby and Sarah told them not to jump to conclusions, but Susie explained that only she would understand why she was that skeptical given the fact that she was the only one who knew about it. Not to mention that she had received her fair share of bullying in that particular form. In the end, all she cared about was bringing Misaki back from oblivion back to their party, and so she promised Susie that she would do so unfailingly. All this while, Misaki was unconscious in the hands of those bullies who had been creeping around Ellie and Susie. They were excited that the girl was dumb enough to fall for their tricks, and all that was left for them was to use her to accomplish their devious aims. In no time, their wish was granted, as from a few meters away, they could hear the angry stomping of the tyrant whom they had been expecting. Before that, Ellie asked Toby and Sarah to help accompany Susie back to town in exchange for proper monetary compensation from her. Susie tried to stop her, telling her that the thing she encountered earlier was a persistent orc, and it would chase her for as long as she was within its sight, even way past the levels. However, Ellie stated that while she was searching for Misaki, she would also have to be protecting Susie, and that would be challenging. But Susie explained that even though she was going to be a burden to Ellie, she couldn't go home and leave her best friend Misaki, and all she wanted from Ellie was for her to understand her feelings. Toby reflected on both sides, noting that Ellie's words sounded plausible enough, because if the rigged treasure box was really meant for her, then she could go and face her assailants by herself. Moreover, it was currently on the second level. Before he could complete his thought process, Sarah enthusiastically suggested that they go and search for Misaki. She knew she was making an unreasonable request, but this was only because she had nearly died when she entered the first level, and she couldn't bear the thought of abandoning someone in a dreadful situation that very moment, all by herself. Almost as if Teresa were in accordance with Sarah, she drew out her weapon as a show of solidarity. With that, Toby told Ellie that he wouldn't be accepting her request, but instead, his party would also help in searching for Misaki. With that, he asked them to temporarily join his party so he could use his support skills on them. Particularly, if he could protect Susie, then Ellie could rest easy. Sarah handled Susie, while Ellie, after being initially defiant, eventually agreed and said there were conditions. In the end, she signed up as a guest at Toby's party while the other girls remained members. She had decided to go solo because her job wasn't suited for short-range engagements when she was in a closed group, and with such a large number of people, going solo would be more convenient. Toby worried that she would be outside the protection of his support skills, but she reassured him that she was fine, especially in that labyrinth, and that was because she was a level 8 player. She handed over a return scroll to Toby, asking him to use it without hesitation because she was counting on him to take care of Susie. Later, he asked if they had a lead when it came to finding Misaka, but just then, Teresa's sensitive ears detected the distant sound of a monster's growl on their current floor. Immediately, Ellie asked Toby to check the logs of Teresa, and she showed him that the girl had an automatic detection skill. However, the skill could only detect the presence of monsters and not humans, meaning they couldn't find Misaki by applying it. However, if there were signs of any human engaging the monster, then it was likely to be Misaki, so it would be worth checking out. Teresa was told to lead the way, and she did lead them down the plains. On the other hand, the ugly guys were gearing up for Ellie's arrival, and one of them soon spotted her arriving at a great speed in their direction. But just then, Ellie soon changed her direction as she had sensed something different. She turned to see a bunch of monsters, ranging from orcs to insects, patrolling the plains. And to their utmost shock, Misaki was lying unconscious, tied up in the middle of the plains, like a sacrifice waiting to be offered to the gods. However, the whole thing wasn't adding up for Toby because no one else was around, and it suddenly felt like something awful was about to happen. As Ellie and Susanna advanced in the direction of Misaki, Toby told them to stop because there might be a trap lurking around. However, it was already too late, as right where they stood, the bullies standing on the cliffs fired multiple arrows into the ground beneath them. From beneath the ground, a giant monster orc appeared, holding an orb, which ushered more orcs onto the battlefield. This was quite a scary sight, but those imbeciles warned Ellie not to run, and instead defeat the tyrant so they would be liberated. With an overwhelming number of orcs reaching out for her, Ellie pulled out her sword while instructing Susanna to take Misaki and move as far back as she could. She also warned her never to try approaching her because she was about to enter berserk mode. In that form, Ellie took down tons of orcs and seemed completely disconnected from reality, slicing through them and getting covered in their own blood, while Susie watched in horror. More of those orcs approached Ellie, but she chopped off their heads, tossing them around like a football, while she herself screamed like a witch who hadn't been laid for an eternity. As Toby watched this drama, he remembered Carton's words when he warned them that there was a brutal named monster on the second level. Without a doubt, he knew that they were facing a monstrosity that they shouldn't be facing, and they couldn't even fight it. Not to mention that it was obvious that this was a properly orchestrated fight, and Ellie was the target. He screamed out, calling to Susie and Ellie to escape by all means necessary. Susie responded that she was all right, so Toby told her to tell Misaki to join their party so they would be using the return scroll. He also asked them to include Ellie, but Susie said Misaki was still unconscious, so there was no way she could join the party. Ellie was a completely different matter altogether, as she was dropping those orcs like chickens without batting an eyelid. They could tell that the Ellie they knew was an entirely different person from the one they were seeing, and they realized that she had actually activated her unique skill, Berserk, which made her get smeared with the victim's blood for her powers to be activated. Toby realized that this was what Ellie meant when she said going solo would be more convenient for her, and this was so she wouldn't injure her companions with her skill. In their current situation, no one's voice would reach Ellie, and if both Ellie and Misaki didn't join Toby's party, then he wouldn't be able to use the return scroll. The bottom line of the matter was that there was no escape for them. Meanwhile, the miscreants who had orchestrated the battle against Ellie and the orcs were simply having the time of their lives, watching her fight with the orcs. She had a higher chance of winning the battle against the orcs, but now that Susie had Misaki, she begged Ellie to come back to her senses so they could escape together. However, Ellie was barely aware of her surroundings and only struggled to call Susie while incoherently muttering words that showed how guilty she felt, saying everything was her fault and she was a murderer. Meanwhile, an orc was about to hit Misaki, but it hit Toby's barrier instead, which he used to protect them. Sarah was worried about Susie's safety and remembered she had gotten a fire-resistant scarf from Carton's shop, so she decided she would cross to the other side and back them up so they could enter the party. She instructed Teresa to stay behind with Toby, while Toby begged her not to be so reckless. However, Sarah said she couldn't bear the thought of leaving anyone in that situation, because someone had to go and help those girls anyway. Immediately, she dashed off, leaving Toby with no option but to trust her and try his best to protect her with his support skills. The moment she arrived, she defended the girls against an orc that was currently tormenting them using her lightning sword and the increased effect of Toby's skill. When she found out that Ellie was still out of her senses, Sarah advised Susie to slap the heck out of the girl's cheeks so she'd be forcefully awakened. The only issue right now was the mountain-like orc that would serve as a barrier to reaching Ellie. And Sarah was too worried about Ellie because she had a bad premonition about leaving the girl in that situation. So she planned to quickly get her back to her senses so she would return to the party. She breezed past those orcs but drew the attention of the mountain orc. While Ellie was dealing with that one, Sarah called out to her from below and told her that everyone desperately needed her back in the party to join the party because Susie was desperately trying to protect her friend. In the process, she encountered more orcs and had to defend herself against them. But soon she was in a tight spot, and the mountain orc raised his hand to smash her. However, Ellie quickly flew in front of Sarah and took the hit for her. As the mountain orc's arm landed on the ground, it caused such an earthquake that it even shook the cliff on which those restless fools were hiding, bringing them to an ultimate fall. Toby and Teresa were safe, but it seemed everyone else had been buried under the debris of the rocks. For Toby, this was a nightmare beyond belief because all three ladies he had been trying to protect were probably dead and gone. But to his utmost surprise, in the midst of the dust, a barrier came rolling forth, all thanks to the powerful nature of his support defense. Sarah and Susie were okay and were really impressed by how powerful Toby's support defense was. However, they noticed Ellie was nowhere to be found, and Sarah recalled that Ellie immediately jumped in front of her to protect her from getting smashed by the mountain orc. She was devastated, realizing that Ellie had sacrificed herself to protect Sarah. From nowhere, though, Ellie appeared from behind, told everyone to step back, and with her sword she aimed at the mountain orc's eyes. The beast groveled around in pain, trying to hit her out of the way, but Ellie eventually got a good aim at its eye. The unfortunate thing was that her sword got deflected, all thanks to the special trait of the monster, which was said to be immune to physical attacks. In other words, no weapon designed for physical attack would work on it, and that was why even though Ellie was standing in front of it, it was unmoved, knowing nothing would happen to it. Ellie slashed relentlessly, but the monster remained unfazed and showed no signs of retaliating either. This made it clear that the monster knew Ellie was just wasting her time, so Toby commanded everyone to retreat, but Susie reminded them that Ellie was still out there fighting for her life, and they couldn't leave her there. They wondered why the monster came in that direction, and Toby thought deeply, realizing that all their weapons were swords and bows. So if this monster was immune to physical attacks, then there had to be something completely different that could work on it. Coincidentally, the monster used a skill known as brutal voice, which sent violent sound waves that consumed the atmosphere and sent Ellie flying to her team members. Because she was outside the barrier, Ellie fell and her body hit the ground, so Susie ran out to rescue her. However, Toby warned Susie not to be so rushed because of Ellie's berserk state. By then, Ellie had already drawn her sword and almost thrust it into Susie's neck. Susie remained firm, and Ellie eventually recognized her but could only faintly mention her name. Susie urged her to get away from there, but Ellie sincerely apologized to her, seeking her forgiveness and regretting that she ever asked her to join her party because she had drawn Susie into her own mess. While everyone kept calling Ellie, she told them she was okay all by herself and said they should just take Misaki and get away from that place. Toby ignored her and was still thinking of a plan since he knew the mountain orc was immune to physical attacks. He then decided to use the blaze shot from the catapult and fired it towards the monster. This surely got a response from the monster, even while Ellie tried getting herself back on her feet. Susie helped Ellie by using her purification magic to restore a bit of her strength, and then told her that she should remember how she felt, because it wasn't only her who was around, but she had a partner who was willing to help, and that if she really saw Susie as her companion, then she shouldn't give up. All the while, the berserk effect on Ellie was gradually fading away, thanks to Susanna's purification skill. The girl tearfully urged her team member to remain persistent and never give up for both of their sakes. Meanwhile, Toby's attack had worked in some way, so he told Teresa to strike its right leg immediately, since her attacks would certainly deal some damage. The plan was for her to use her attack, and he'd buff them up, since his attack buff skill wasn't a physical attribute. He urged her to delay the monster so they could make time for everyone to escape, but jumping in front of her was Ellie, who asked him to give her the same buff as he was giving Teresa, because the fight would be over in a minute. Also in the process, she asked to join his party, and she successfully registered as a member. With that, Teresa and Ellie got busy at the same time, delivering multiple strikes to different areas of the monster. In the end, the monster fell with a mighty thud, and all that was left was the hope that the girls had successfully defeated it. Ellie and Teresa came back, and Suzu rushed to hug Ellie, so everyone was glad that Ellie was in one piece. Misaki was still fast asleep while her captors remained unconscious in the ruins. Misaki, in her sleep, unconsciously placed her hands between Sarah's thighs and turned up the heat. They were all glad to see that she had shown signs of being awake. Much later, Tessie went to touch the corpse of the monster, and in its palm, she found an item drop. Later, Toby used his recovery magic on Ellie, and most of her injuries had disappeared, thanks to his support skill to recover a companion positioned in the front. Ellie confessed that she wasn't aware that monsters with resistance to physical weapons would spawn in the beginner's labyrinth of the 8th district, which was why she was confident rushing in alone, and so she was grateful to Toby for coming to her rescue. When Misaki got up, she was crazy confused and couldn't believe that they had defeated that giant monster. She then confessed that after opening the box, she was greeted by those scoundrels, who seemed to be quite shady, but besides her encounter with them, she couldn't remember much. Also, the crew noticed that the shady men weren't attacking them or anything of that sort, meaning they no longer had any business with them or were caught up in the previous battle. Eddie said they could report them to the guild for clearly violating the laws provided for seekers, and Misaki hugged Susie, thanking her for coming to her rescue. It was time for them to rush back to town, but the dead monster was too big and wouldn't fit into their license's storage capacity, so they decided to collect its nails and fangs and put a request for couriers who would take care of the rest of the corpse. After a while, Teresa descended from the monster's body and joined them, handing over the treasure box she had found on the monster. However, Eddie instantly warned them not to open it so they wouldn't have to relive the trauma of what had happened due to Misaki opening the other treasure box. However, Misaki pointed out that this box was different from the one she had opened previously, and Ellie confirmed that it was actually also her first time seeing the black treasure box. Meanwhile, they returned to the surface, and Sarah was too uncomfortable to move around in her thoughty clothes, so she decided to return to the hotel suite. Toby sent all the girls to freshen up at the suite while he and Teresa would proceed to the guild. On the way, Eddie thanked him for inviting her and her girls, and offered her knowledge of the world to appreciate his kindness, and also to share more about herself and her sword. Later, when they got to the guild, Louisa was shocked to find that the monster named Juggernaut had been subdued yet again by Toby and his party. Once more, she fainted like she did the previous time, and they had to resuscitate her. This was because previously it was the Redface they defeated on the first level of the labyrinth, and it was unfortunate that it was novices who seemed to be encountering these named monsters who weren't supposed to be on that floor, not to add that it happened on 2 consecutive days. Louisa asked him how he was able to complete the subjugation and who he really was, but Toby didn't know what to say other than that he was a rear guard who was a little peculiar. Louisa explained further why she was in that state of shock. It turns out that named monsters possessed varied special characteristics and could get aggressive against an individual. When a person became a target, even if they entered the floor level during the succeeding days, such monsters would continue to stay aggressive until that individual was defeated. This means that probably the 3 idiots who had captured Misaki were the original targets, and Misaki was used as bait for Ellie, so she could come and help defeat the monster that had targeted them. Essentially, they committed the crime of abducting targets with the aim of profiteering, so Louisa reassured Toby that the guild would pass judgment on those fools. This made Toby curious about who was governing the country, perhaps a king or president of some sort, but she said the one in power was actually the chief of the Great Temple and the representatives of the guild, such as Louisa and her colleagues. Adam also asked her how it was possible because it was said that once someone had reincarnated, they automatically could only become a seeker, but Louisa said that was the intention of the higher-ups. This was because there was a place called Labyrinth outside their country, existing somewhere else in the world, and there was an entrance to transfer from their current world to that labyrinth, which was only available in their own country. She told him, though, that she couldn't particularly share how their country came to be because she didn't know that, but they set that aside, and she went on to verify the results of their exploration. In that single fight against the Juggernaut, Toby secured over 1,600 points and was updated to the 7th district. She was shocked and speechless but eventually smiled, saying that if that was the current trend, then he would soon be graduating from the 8th district. She was already missing him, saying she wished him nothing but the best, but he asked her if he could keep her as his counselor. She was shocked that he wanted to stay with her and said she wasn't much acquainted with that district, but he was always welcome. Thereafter, he invited her for dinner after she was done wrapping up her reports, and later she told him that the reward for defeating the Juggernaut was 100 gold coins. However, she handed him cash, saying the best reward right now would be to make Teresa his official party member. After receiving his reward, he took the reward and paid Teresa's handler, Layla. Layla was surprised to see such a large amount of money, but she realized that it was obtained after they defeated the enormous mountain orc. She asked Toby to confirm that he wanted to officially recognize Teresa as a member, and he did so, but she told him that, as a warning, if he ever kicked Teresa from his party, the mercenary guild would take her back, and if he ever came back for Teresa after kicking her out, Layla would never let him have her again. However, Toby said he wouldn't dismiss Teresa ever, and the old lady smiled, saying she was envious. She stretched out her arm and hugged Teresa, telling her to take good care of herself, and then she shared with Toby that back then she used to explore in the hopes of saving demihumans, but she soon knew it was a lost cause after discovering her own lack of power. At the very least, she provided them with a place to belong and still considered it as an option until that day. Even though this was her own selfishness, she wanted to share something intimate with him. They stayed discussing until it was dark, and on his way back, Toby bumped into the girls on their way to a restaurant. However, they noticed that his countenance was giving a serious vibe and asked him what was up. He then asked Louisa if it was true that there was a great temple in the 4th district where they could turn Teresa back to being human. Louisa responded that she heard the great temple in the 4th district had people who could revert demihumans to being human, but arriving at that district was no easy feat. Toby said that even though it was only 2 days he had spent with Teresa, she had repeatedly gone out of her way to save him from harm, and without her, he wouldn't be alive. It didn't matter to him, as such, how difficult or easy it was, because all he wanted to do was bring Teresa back to her human form. Sarah agreed with him and held Louisa's hand, saying that when she was back to being human, they would have lots of girl talk. Ellie, however, seemed awfully quiet, so Toby asked her if she had ever been to the 4th district. She said she had unfortunately only arrived up to the 5th district, but would certainly be able to break through for sure. With that, Toby formed a meeting and asked the ladies if they would all want to form a party with him, Sarah, and Teresa, and head towards the upper district together. Misaki was surprised that she was included, but asked if she wouldn't be a bother, so Toby told her that no one knew what was in store for them beyond the district, and since there was a senior hunter among them, nothing was more reassuring than that. He reminded them of what they had just encountered, saying a monster with insane attributes appeared, and they cooperated and successfully pushed through. Ellie didn't seem convinced, saying that even though Toby had a point, he would first have to hear what she had to share about her sword and about herself before jumping to conclusions. She began saying that her sword was called the Scarlet Emperor, which could help one gain tremendous combat strength by bathing with the enemy's blood. But in return, the wielder of the sword would become excited, attacking everything nearby regardless of enemies or allies. This explained to the others why Ellie was acting weird earlier on, but Toby then asked why she kept wielding such a dangerous sword, and she went on to share that once a person equipped the sword, a curse triggered and altered the current job to a unique job that could never be parted with. This was why it was called the Death Sword, and that was her current job, even though she was previously an ordinary swordsman. Susie asked if the curse could be dispelled, but Ellie said she wasn't sure if there was any of that because it never really mattered to her at that time, provided that she knew her sword would improve her party's overall strength, even at the cost of her getting cursed. This was a tenet from her former companions, the White Knight Brigade, who were the guys she had previously warned Toby and his party about because they constantly searched for resources or rare jobs as members. Back when she was with them, she had a great desire to become stronger, but now all that was left of her was regret. However, Louisa shared that cursed equipment, such as her sword, was sealed by guild-certified craftsmen, and except she wasn't made aware of it, if she sealed the equipment, then it would be useless. Although that was not an option for those who gave priority to getting stronger. Ellie said that even if the weapons weren't sealed, it wasn't prohibited to be under the risk of a curse, as long as her team members accomplished their goals of advancing to the upper districts. Sacrificing a few companions wouldn't matter, and unfortunately, her best friend was still in that party, waiting for her from the depths of that labyrinth. She confessed, sadly, and begged Suzuna to forgive her for keeping the information from her all the while. Ellie said she couldn't go back alone to the labyrinth where her best friend was because no one in the upper districts was willing enough to join her for the job. That was why she went into the lower districts to search for companions, swore to help them raise their levels, and then move to higher districts. She also said she was disgusted at the way her ex-party members, the brigade, used others, but she was doing exactly what they were doing. To lighten up the gloomy mood and environment, Misaki tried to cheer everyone up, while Susie said that if Ellie was just using her, then she wouldn't have helped her to find Misaki. Ellie had been treating Misaki as though they had known each other for the longest time. In fact, Ellie was the one who fought tooth and nail for Susie's best friend, so without hesitating, Susie extended her hand to Ellie and said they would go together because she would like to return the favor to Ellie. Thereafter, Toby also said that he, Sarah, and Teresa would like to be their companions and cooperate with Ellie on her objectives. Ellie was shocked because she had assumed that they would be frightened by her, but Toby said that if they ever arrived at that kind of battle situation again, they would support her from a manageable distance. Rather than playing it safe, there was no reliable vanguard who was better than she was, so they'd take the risk with her. She smiled and welcomed him aboard, and they all treated themselves to a nice meal. Ellie asked Toby what his plans for the following day were, and he said he was interested in opening the black treasure box and going to the labyrinth afterwards. Louisa also pledged her support to Toby because she was deeply moved by his speech and was willing to do her best to help him. However, seeing her touch Toby's hand made Sarah boil in a fit of rage. So she told him to back off because she'd been with him even before they got reincarnated. The girls went back and forth, and Susie snatched the chance to shoot her shot by accidentally spilling a drink on Toby's hand. She swiped her fingers back and forth, claiming she would wipe it away when all she really wanted to do was make him scream her name. It seemed in the end all the ladies got into a petty fight over who'd be close to him, so they decided to settle it with expired piss. Thereafter, Louisa and Sarah went haywire, embarrassing themselves and dancing around. In the end, everyone returned to Toby's suite, and the wasted girls were dragged into this room. Toby slept on the sofa, and the next morning everyone was up, prepared to visit the craftsman who would be helping them open the black treasure box. They arrived at the said location, but were shocked to find a giant wolf with two young ones riding on its back, welcoming Toby and his girls to their shop. As the kids came down, one of them threw a fuss while they ran to their mom, whose melons were huge enough to feed a nation. It turned out that it was their mom, Falma, who would be opening their treasure box because she was the guild's certified trap specialist. When she turned her attention to them, she asked them if they knew that the box was extremely dangerous, but that statement crippled Toby to his core. She led them down a secret passage, and one of them asked her questions about her huge dog, so she responded that the dog was a silver hound and a seeker's escort dog capable of fighting monsters. However, the dog was currently just babysitting and being barely useful. They arrived at Falma's shop, and she explained that in order to use the atelier's service without worries, 3 conditions needed to be met to run a guild-certified box workshop. The first was the ability to transfer to a room dedicated to opening boxes. The second was to pass the guild box opening skills assessment held yearly, and the third was to possess the proper equipment. All of that was to raise the probability of undoing the barrier lock to more than 10%. In the end, all of this was to demonstrate that Falma was highly skilled, and her status window showed that her finger technique was at level 44 with a success rate of 100%. She explained that the box Toby had was a black box, which was seldom encountered in their shop, not even once a year, and this meant that there was something rare and valuable inside. The problem was that it was rigged with a destructive trap, and there was an incident where a box was forcibly opened, leading a section of the city to explode into nothingness, and she didn't want it to happen again. Even though a box of that type was dangerous, her experience and skills had never disappointed her, so with wholehearted commitment, she was willing to open it. A few movements here and there, and with deep concentration, Falma had figured out her way through the invisible maze of the box, and it was time to open it. The system used to keep the box shut was like a defensive mechanism designed to protect the box from being opened, and the goal was to guide the ball of light into the box, which would open it as long as she could guide it without touching the boundary and losing sight of the path. In the process, she encountered a very narrow section but successfully made it through, and in the end, the box was successfully opened. Following that, tens of thousands of coins fell out of the box, and Falmer seemed rather unmoved because such rare boxes usually yielded a plentiful reward. Among the things that fell out, Toby found a key, but Ellie warned him not to touch it until after finding out whether it was cursed. Falmer said there was no issue because she also did appraisals at her shop, but the odor from her pits almost made Toby pass out, and so Sarah advised her to take a shower right away. Among the other gifts, Toby found an ebony slingshot, a short sword, and a silk sash, which he gave to Susan. Also, there was a light lady steel armor, which he handed to Sarah, but she was kind of pissed because it was displaying her Milky Way to the world. As for Toby's weapon, Ellie said there was a slot available to fit a rune, and these runes were created from processing a sufficient lot of magic stones, which would enable one to do attribute attacks and defend against abnormal status conditions. Afterward, Susie and Sarah both shared that they had increased levels and skill points, but were confused about which particular skills to learn. Toby also complained about being in the same situation, and Falma offered to help them out if they would linger around for a while. They played with her kids and much later arrived at the labyrinth. After dealing with some orcs, they finally arrived at the third level of the labyrinth and found some mutant one-eyed mammoths. Immediately, Toby activated his support boost and increased everyone's morale as they went head-to-head against the creepy monsters. However, these monsters seemed to possess a special effect named Gaze, which was a stun effect that made their opponents freeze in place. Their first target was Misaki, and Sarah followed afterwards. She stood still and was unable to move even as two beasts approached from both sides. But soon, Toby set her free and she launched a double attack which concurrently struck both targets. At the same time, Misaki soon regained freedom of movement, while another mammoth ran to attack her. She threw 2 dice at it, but thanks to Toby's special buff, it created a significant halting effect on the monster, preventing it from moving easily. Since she discovered the power of the dice, she kept throwing them at the beasts one after the other. Eventually, Susie finished it off by firing an arrow into its eye, which rendered it defeated. Apparently, the animal was called a gaze hound. Sarah asked Toby what happened when he called her attention, and the effect suddenly disappeared. Toby explained that it was all thanks to the support boost, which was the effect of his new skill, and somehow managed to raise their morale. By collecting enough morale, one could use it to clear an abnormal status, and it could also serve as a mental health gauge. The girls were still not clear on it, so Ellie confirmed that morale burst was specific to a job and activated a powerful skill. She believed it was accumulated with the help of Toby's skill, and if it was not used repeatedly in battle, it would accumulate even more. After hearing this, Toby suggested that he would only try it once, because no matter how strong it wasn't good to use it in combat without knowing its effects. He placed Susie and Misaki at a distance from everyone, and then activated the morale burst on them. However, while the girls were in an excited and frenzied state, a very dark monster lurked in the forest without their knowledge. After the effect was unleashed on them, Misaki's special skill, known as Fortune Roll, followed suit, an effect that was supposed to make the target's next action automatically succeed. This worked perfectly on both Misaka and Suzy, but following that, a bright light shone from the sky, kicking the girls out of their dazed and frenzied state. Suzy suggested that they head in the direction of where the light descended, because she thought there might be some valuable treasure there. But Toby said that even if they were checking what the light descended upon, it was not only for treasure, but also to know whether Misaki's fortune roll targeted friends only or both friends and enemies. Eventually, they agreed to go check the place out, and when they got there, they found it looking rather too beautiful for anything crazy to happen. Misaki immediately grabbed a spear to dig up the treasure because she was very sure the jackpot was underground, and since Suzy's special skill led them there, it meant there was certainly something going on. After much digging, they found what Misaki assumed was a treasure, but Ellie said it was a pad to teleport them to another level because she had used it before in another labyrinth. However, something wasn't just right. The Plains of Dawn, where they were currently located, should only have 3 levels, so that meant the pad could transfer them to the first or second level. But Ellie felt that such contraptions, which should have led to various levels, shouldn't be buried. Someone suggested that they could use it to teleport back to the guild, but Toby insisted that they explore the 3rd level a little more before using it. However, right above them, another light was shining and Teresa noticed it on time. So she quickly grabbed Sarah out of the way right before some weird thing landed a tentacle-like substance on Misaki. Eventually, Misaki was placed directly on the pad that was found underground, and all they were hoping for was that the pad wouldn't activate. But before they knew it, yet again, Misaki disappeared due to the effect of the pad. Next, the tentacle-like thing began searching for another target, so Toby protected the rest of the girls with his barrier. They all realized they couldn't see the monster's incoming attacks, meaning it was a monster so swift that they couldn't see it with their naked eyes. Ellie, however, pointed out that there was no such monster in that labyrinth, but if it was in the 3rd level, then it had to be an invisible monster. Sarah suggested that the monster could be transparent, but at this point, it had already wrapped her in its tentacle-like appendage and begun squeezing all the soft things it could find. Ellie immediately realized that this monster could be the Plane Eater. With Sarah down and Misaki disappeared, Suzy only wanted to go and search for her friend, but Toby told her to hang in there, because the fact that the slate hadn't disappeared meant Misaki could return from the other side, and it was important for them not to be separated from each other. However, he secretly wondered what the case might be if it were a one-way teleportation. For now, they had to do something about the Plane Eater that was transparent and difficult to visualize. Toby asked Teresa, after noticing her movements, whether she could tell where the enemy was located, while Ellie said that it was possible Teresa could because she was using an enemy scan. However, Toby said they needed more than just that and required the precise location of the monster, so he asked Teresa to help him pinpoint the precise location of the monster. Using her enemy scan feature, Teresa began searching, and Toby told Suzy that she could shoot her arrows based on perception. She did so and heard the sound of her arrow against the skin of the monster, which instantly helped them to locate where it was. The moment they could see the monster, they repeatedly attacked it, and Suzy's arrow finally ended it. Now it was time for them to wait to see if Misaki was coming back, but there was no sign of her, and this confirmed Toby's fears that it was a one-way teleport pad. Since there was no helping it, Sarah said it was time they should go and search for her, since Misaki wasn't the type to stay in one place. However, Toby said he would go alone because he had a return scroll and would use it to get back the moment he found Misaki. Even though it would greatly reduce the contribution they had earned, he would be the one to get out of the party, and they should just meet again once they returned to town. He tasked Ellie with taking care of everyone, but Sarah stopped him, holding his hand and asking him what he planned to do if he couldn't use his support skills there, and whether he wasn't aware of the risk he was taking. She told him then that she would follow him since she could handle a spear, and neither Suzy nor Ellie agreed to be left behind. In the end, he couldn't stop the girls from following him, and they all teleported using the pad to the location where Misaki was taken. They eventually arrived at a tunnel-like structure where they found Misaki, but the moment they tried to return home with the return scroll, it was out of range. This meant they had no choice but to go forward since they were stuck there. After walking for a while, they encountered a mighty monster bird. The plan was to avoid triggering it, but this one was already prepared for trouble. After checking the status window, Toby found out that this monster was the giant eagle-headed warrior, which was at level 6 and even more powerful than the mountain orc juggernaut. Instantly, Toby told the girls to all get in front of him so he could use his support to help them, and then urged them to stay with the party so they would all return home alive. At the start, Toby used his morale burst on everyone so they would all find out what skills each of them would obtain from getting their morale boosted. In Ellie's case, she knew that unless certain conditions were met while she was in a berserk state, she would not be able to activate morale bursts, which was why they should all remain careful. However, Sarah said that it was just like it was with Susie, and no one would know what skills they would obtain unless they used the morale bursts. As the eagle-headed warrior approached them, Toby realized that the monster was sizing them up to know where to start attacking from. So Toby used his hawk eyes to foretell the monster's moves. He immediately noticed that the monster planned to thrust its sword towards and into Ellie, and so he warned her to back off. That really did turn out to be the case, so they were shocked, wondering how he was able to tell that he shared that. In addition to supporting morale, he acquired an additional skill that was only limited to objects visible to him. This skill could assess his target's potential and predict their next action by knowing where the aggro was directed and obtaining information that was invisible to others. Next, he warned Sarah to approach the monster from the right, and she did escape a fatal blow from the monster's scythe, which boosted everyone's confidence, because seeing that even without using his morale burst skill, it meant they stood a chance against this hideous creature. He went on directing the girls on what moves to make to avoid fatal hits from the monster, but no matter what they did and how skillfully they launched attacks against it, the monster stood on its feet. However, they noticed that a part of the monster's legs was chipping away due to their attacks, meaning that Toby's support magic was effective for them. Susie tried to attack the monster with her arrows, but they only bounced off the shield. This was just a distraction for Ellie so that she would approach it and use a skill known as Blossom Blade, which helped her deliver multiple simultaneous attacks on the monster's body. What no one knew was that Toby was having a hard time because using his Hawkeye's skill was consuming an extensive amount of energy. But right when things were getting better for them, the monster suddenly screeched, and something changed in its eyes, so Toby warned the girls to get away from it. A few transformations here and there, and the monster looked like the angry goddess of Tahiti. This was all thanks to its survival instinct skill, which boosted all its statuses and placed it in optimal mode. In a nutshell, this was a completely different monster from what they had just been fighting. It was evident when Ellie tried using her sonic raid speed attacks, but the monster quickly caught up with them and learned her movements. He threw her as he broke a pillar, but Toby's support barrier temporarily protected her. At the same time, the monster activated a wind burst and was headed straight for Teresa, who was also in a barrier. So her barrier was destroyed instantly, leading to a crash. It was crazy that this monster suddenly became unreasonably strong, so Misaki urged everyone to make a run for it. However, Toby realized his moral burst skill was available, so he planned to use it on Sarah and Teresa. It was no news that using skills without knowing their capabilities in the middle of such a crucial fight was a bad move, but that was the only thing they could do to defeat that crazy monster. He asked Teresa if she could still fight, and when she nodded, he told her they were counting on her. But at this time, the monster had already ascended high into the air and was about to land its spear directly on Ellie. However, he bypassed her, and she instantly warned everyone to take cover because it seemed this monster was about to unleash something that could destroy everyone in there. In no time, multiple weaponized feathers landed in different parts of the building, crashing it down with its pillars. Ellie was moderately protected thanks to the power of Toby's long-lasting barrier, and so were the other girls. However, while everyone was celebrating that all the girls were safe and even planning their revenge attack, they soon discovered that Toby himself was at the point of death. While still unconscious, Toby saw flashbacks of his accident and was soon called back to the present by the voices of his girls. He woke up and pulled out a shrapnel from his side, which made him bleed out profusely. Thereafter, he began analyzing the situation, seeing that the beast attacked like a juggernaut, and if it rendered him unable to support himself, he could suffer a direct hit. Sarah ran to inspect his injury but found him gripping his side from which he was bleeding. The girls were devastated, and Sarah soon told them that everyone had to get out of there because if they stayed in that position, then Toby would be dead before they knew it. Ellie only discovered then that Toby had been hit, but in her brief moment of panic and distraction, the monster attacked her with his deadly feather, and she was only lucky that it didn't pierce through the barrier. Toby got up saying it was no longer possible to find a way out of their situation, and in the end, they would be pursued to the very place from which they came. However, his skill safeguarded everyone from the monster's feathers so they could still overcome it and take the beast down. Sarah told him to shut up and stop spouting nonsense because he was injured and needed immediate treatment. Still, Toby said the only place they could get adequate medical attention was in the guild's medical facility. He cheered her up and activated his morale burst on her and Teresa, adding that he was counting on them. In fact, he told them he was capable of supporting them all, so they should all know he had them covered. Even though the girls would rather not, they realized this was their fighting chance, and they had to use it to the best of their ability. As Sarah and Teresa jumped into action, Susie and Misaka tied a piece of cloth around Toby's wound, telling him he could lean on them while they fought. It wasn't easy for any of the girls, especially Ellie, who was at the forefront of this and dealing with the sonic speed of this monster. When all hope seemed lost, someone managed to strike a crippling blow on the beast with their sword, and Ellie assumed it was one of the other girls. But to her utmost surprise, she found that it was a strange girl who looked exactly like her. Does Ellie have a clone? Will Toby survive his injuries or bleed to death? And will the girls ever make it back to the surface without a return scroll? If you'd like to see how it all plays out in Part 2, type Juggernaut's nuts in the comment section. If you enjoyed the video, give a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for similar content. As always, thanks for watching.